Hello, everyone, and welcome to the podcast, Life is a Story We Tell Ourselves. This episode is all about the great outdoors. The President of the United States proclaimed the month of June as Great Outdoors Month, stating in part, America's great outdoors, diverse landscapes, and pristine waterways are a limitless source of pride, inspiration, and sustenance of both body and soul, and an essential part of our national identity. It is our shared responsibility as Americans to be good stewards of these irreplaceable treasures for our children and grandchildren, and for generations to come. During Great Outdoors Month, we celebrate our nation's natural wonders and rededicate ourselves to conserving nature's splendor for all Americans and safeguarding our environment against the existential threat of climate change and other challenges. So joining us to talk about the great outdoors is Derek Crandall. Mr. Crandall served as president and CEO of the American Recreation Coalition from 1981 to 2019 and has proven that the great outdoors is what makes America great. He is currently chairman of the board of the CORE Network and also serves as co-chair of the Coalition of Recreational Trails. He was a member of the President's Commission on Americans Outdoors from 1985 to 1987, and he received the Chevron Conservation Award and was named to the President's Commission on Environmental Quality in 1991. So Derek, we've known each other for years. Welcome to the program.
Hello, Don, and thank you for all that you have done for year after year after year. As you say, we share a long and rich history of working on the same issues and cooperating in terms of some of the progress along the way.
That's certainly true. So, Derek, why don't you tell our listeners what inspired you to become such a champion and advocate of outdoor recreation?
Well, sometimes you just make good choices. I grew up in a family that did spend some time camping in national parks and state parks and other kinds of places. I grew up in the Northeast. We didn't have the big Y parks and other kinds of things, but we had Acadia and we had some other kinds of things. And frankly, growing up in a family that didn't have a lot of excess cash to spend on vacations, camping was the solution. We camped in a lot of places. I then went to college. My undergraduate work was at Dartmouth College in Hanover, New Hampshire. It's one of the very few schools that exists right along a major national recreational trails. In this case, the Appalachian Trail comes right through downtown Hanover, right before the dorm that I was living in. And I became a chairman of the Dartmouth Outing Club, and we managed about 90 miles of the Appalachian Trail. So I ran into something of unexpected opportunities to spend time in the White Mountains and to just have all kinds of opportunities, whether it was on the Connecticut River, doing paddling, and whether it was skiing at the Dartmouth ski area. So I really had a wonderful introduction. And then I came down to Washington, D.C. to work at the newly formed Environmental Protection Agency for Bill Ruckelshaus as a special assistant for youth outreach. And I got the chance to work on some very important issues involving public lands back in the 1970s. So I lucked out and I abandoned plans to go to law school and became a full advocate for the great outdoors beginning in the 1970s.
Well, I'm interested to know in your early experiences camping. People often talk about, they remember camping with their parents and spending time in the great outdoors. Was there a seminal moment for you or something you recall more than anything else as an experience in the great outdoors that may have affected you or may have even changed your life?
Well, of course, there were the cold water showers in Acadia National Park. When Mom said, you have to take a shower, you haven't taken a shower for 2 days. No, but I guess I would say time with seasonal rangers in places like Acadia, going down into the tidal pools and having the seasonal rangers talk about the life at that kind of interface between the land and the water and point out to where there were lobster traps and boats out there that were harvesting off of the national park there. So I think I just remember this wonderful storytelling by Park Service rangers that really captured me.
Yeah, I understand. Well, you mentioned national parks, and when most people think of the great outdoors, the national parks immediately come to mind. But the truth is, the great outdoors is made up of a web of local and regional parks, national forests, agricultural lands, waterways, wildlife preserves. Why don't you take a moment and share with us how this web has come together over the years and how it's protected?
Well, the ownership of nearly a third of this nation by us, the American public, is in some respects an accident. As a person raised in the Northeast, there wasn't as much public land as proportionate as we find overall in the nation. And so therefore, one of the great eye-opening opportunities for me was to be looking at national policies and learning that we had states like Alaska, Nevada, and others where a majority of the state is owned by everybody. And to come to know agencies like the Bureau of Land Management and to look at a variety of other national systems. And then you become a true believer that American conservation leadership has been a contributor globally to the idea that we have to protect some of these special places, despite the fact they may have timber or oil and gas or other kinds of things. And we as a nation can be very proud that we have put together major national and state systems. And there's so many stories to be told. I mean, I just love the fact that back in the 1930s, under the CCC program, FDR created something like 48 recreation demonstration areas that were eventually mostly spun off to the states and are now some of our principal state park units, particularly in the eastern U.S. Of course, a couple were held out. Camp David, for example, was one of those national recreation demonstration areas and is now a presidential retreat. But there was such a contribution to demonstrating how we could go back and restore lands and build infrastructure. Just outside of Washington, D.C. is the Prince William Forest Park, which always astonishes me. It's the park unit that has the most CCC built actual structures, and it was designed to be a retreat for kids out of Washington, D.C. to be able to get out of the heat, out of the humidity, and come down to a forested area and enjoy time in the summer in the great outdoors. What a great visionary step. And that's been something that we've done. So as you said, we have this really diverse array of local and county and state and federal lands that together constitute about almost a third of the entire surface area of the United States.
Well, and I really appreciate how you continue to put it, these lands that you were talking about, whether it's Bureau of Land Management, Forest Service, or National Wildlife Preserves. People like to say that it's government land. It's not government land. It's the land that belongs to the people. This is government of, for, and by the people. And so these lands are actually owned by the people. And I think that's extremely important. And you mentioned FDR. He said in a speech when he was talking about national parks once, and I'm paraphrasing, that the national parks represent the fact that the land and the water belong to the people. And this whole proclamation about this being the Great Outdoors Month is all about people and their land. And I think that's an important thing for our listeners and people in general to remember. So, Derek, visitation to parks and natural areas has really increased over the years, leading unfortunately, to worn and often dysfunctional infrastructure. So the National Park Service alone, for example, has over $1 billion in maintenance backlog. The United States infrastructure in general is all the political topic now. It's a major focus of this new presidential administration. So from your perspective, what work is being done to address this issue, and have things improved over the last few decades, or do we still have a lot of work to do with our infrastructure in the great outdoors?
Well, great questions, Don. The first thing I would say is that, yes, it is true. We have seen a growth in the number of visits to federal and other lands that belong to all of us, but we've been losing our share of the leisure time that Americans invest in terms of going to public lands. We have not competed during the 80s and the 90s with theme parks and cruises and a variety of others. If you look at the proportion of the American publics that actually visit our national parks, for example, it's actually down. Our visitation would be about 50% higher if we had continued the share of leisure time that we had back in the 1970s. But after saying that, I think that we know that we have a need to add infrastructure, maintain infrastructure, to be able to protect these lands as we do see more people come. Don, you of course were a professional in the field for years and years and years, and you understand that whether it's Olmsted, whether it's other people who are some of the principal designers of infrastructure in the great outdoors, they talked about the importance of hardening certain portions. Right now, our national parks do get almost, we'll be back over 300 million visits again this year, even though it dipped last year because of COVID-19. But a disproportionate share of those visitations are actually on or really adjacent to the paved surfaces. These are people who are seeing our national parks through their windshields.
Right.
I think you and I share an interest in making sure that they get out of whatever they're riding in and going out and actually getting a park experience that involves walking a trail, seeing a waterfall, seeing wildlife, doing all those kinds of fun things and getting away from the roads. But we have seen that the appropriated dollars for national park and other major public land holdings have not allowed us to keep up, whether it's the built environment that provides things like visitor centers, or whether it's the trails and the roads and the other kinds of things. We have seen a backlog of deferred maintenance that exceeds $20 billion at the national level and $12 billion in the national parks, and it's getting worse. Now, we had a major congressional action in December of 2020, despite all of the controversy over politics and everything else. We saw a wonderful leadership by bipartisan legislators come around and support and be able to pass the Great American Outdoors Act. What that does is it provides permanent funding to the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which of course is a legacy of the early 1960s and the Outdoor Recreation Resources Review Commission, but it also is a major investment in terms of attacking the infrastructure backlog. It'll provide $6 billion over the first 5 years to actually go in and deal with problems that are as diverse as, again, trails that really need to be rebuilt to control everything from erosion to other kinds of issues, and visitor centers that frankly are outdated and no longer are good forums for telling stories, and campgrounds that were designed back in the 50s and 60s and no longer accommodate the lifestyles and the expectations of the American public. So there's a great need for progress, and I'm really excited that the Congress has actually seen that and taken action. Now, the one thing I would add is there's great promise as we look ahead. The American public votes with their checkbooks and votes with their feet, and we can win that war. We've seen, especially because of COVID-19, sales of things like boats and RVs and a variety of even things like fishing tackle has soared. The American public understands, appreciates, loves the outdoors, and is willing to spend. And we need to make sure that the provision of access to and the management of infrastructure on our public lands capitalizes on this willingness of the American public to purchase what they need, to have the experiences that they want.
Absolutely. Well, you mentioned the Great Americans Outdoors Act, which is as you say, an act that funds permanently the Land and Water Conservation Fund. I used to call the Land and Water Conservation Fund America's best kept secret. I also called it the act that saved America. And it's interesting that most people don't know about the Land and Water Conservation Fund. And even more interestingly, I mean, I worked all over the nation and with many local park and recreation authorities, and many of them didn't know about the existence of the Land and Water Conservation Fund. Why don't you take a minute and explain to people, what this legacy is? Where did the Land and Water Conservation Fund come from? How much of a fund it is? And in particular, the most important thing that people don't know about the fund is that it doesn't cost them a penny as taxpayers.
Well, again, we have done some amazing things as a nation in a bipartisan way around this concept of conservation. The roots of the Land and Water Conservation Fund go back to during the Eisenhower administration, the creation of the Outdoor Recreation Resources Review Commission, chaired by Lawrence Rockefeller, and with wonderful people like Scoop Jackson and others, major members of Congress, with a wonderful, wonderful legacy of conservation causes. We saw a flurry of legislation that came from that, the Wilderness Act, the National Rivers and Trails Acts, and a variety of other kind of things. But one of the most significant, sort of this keystone of conservation going ahead, was the idea that the nation owned as an entity oil and gas resources offshore, and that as we sold those resources and they were put into the commercial use, we should capture some of that and reinvest that as a nation. That was the concept behind the Land and Water Conservation Fund. So it was royalties on oil and gas owned by all of us offshore. When sold, that there would be a recapture provision, and that money, up to $1 billion a year, would be spent in two funds, a federal fund and a state fund. And it was a great concept. Unfortunately, until this year, it was only once that the Congress appropriated the full amount of money that was promised under the Land and Water Conservation Fund. So it's gone on. It's done wonderful things. There are investments that total now billions and billions of dollars in additional parks and national forests and wildlife refuges and more. But we at this point needed to move ahead and make sure that in the 21st century we had full funding for that. I am especially pleased to say that in 1987, as the President's Commission on Americans Outdoors, on which I had the fun of serving, wrapped up, and we had people, it was led by Lamar Alexander, with our Vice Chairman Gil Grosvenor, the Chairman of the
National Geographic.
National Geographic, but with Mo Udall and others on this, and we talked about land and water. One of our recommendations was to fully fund the Land and Water Conservation Fund. So that was part of our 8 or 10 recommendations. Fortunately, people like Lamar Alexander came out of the President's Commission, and he never forgot the importance of the Land and Water Conservation Fund. So it is an important kind of recognition that he was a principal player in making sure that the Congress came back and revisited time and time again. He left the Congress in January of this year, 2021. But one of his things he wanted to do before he left was to make sure that the permanent funding for the Land and Water Conservation Fund was accomplished. And so he and a number of R's and D's all worked together, and it became a love feast talking about this. And again, at the federal level, it's largely restricted to buying additional land to fill out systems and to purchase key tracts to protect the national parks, national forests, the wildlife refuges, and others. At the state level, the uses are a little bit more ambitious. And it has also been very important because as a nation, we understand now that the outdoors isn't just little blocks of land in isolation, but most of them are tied together with things like greenways and blueways along river corridors and other kinds of things. And the Land and Water Conservation Fund is playing and will long play a key role in integrating these gems by providing the connecting necklace around those.
Well, not only that, the interesting thing for me, having been involved in outdoor recreation and the great American outdoors on the state, national, and local level, is the fact that, soccer moms, soccer dads, people that just take casual walks in the park, whether it's their local neighborhood park or even Central Park, or baseball diamonds. All of these things are supported on the state side through these grant programs that are run by the state and local governments. So if you have a baseball field in your neighborhood or a soccer field or just the park where you can go sit on a park bench or sit in front of a lake and feed the ducks or the squirrels, those are all supported as well by the Land and Water Conservation Fund. So it's a very comprehensive fund, from things like the Grand Canyon to your neighborhood park where you can sit and feed the ducks. And that's the thing that I think is so wonderful about that program.
Yeah, and you're pointing out something why it never was permanently funded, because although it's doing all this good, the good was largely invisible. There weren't signs like you have around highways where you see a construction project and says this improvement in the road is being paid for by, and it has the name of the governor, and it has other kinds of people where there's sort of a recognition that the money didn't just show up there. Mm-hmm. In fact, Land and Water Conservation Fund, I always remember an example, Ralph Regula of Ohio, a member of Congress, and chairman of the Appropriations Committee over the Park Service for years, would say it was the height of irony as he argued for higher appropriations of the Land and Water Conservation Fund. It would be an opponent of his in a race for the House of Representatives in Ohio that would take credit for the ball fields and the other investments in his congressional district in Ohio, not pass it along to Ralph Regula. So I guess the point we're making is that it was not earmarked funding, and in fact, the members of Congress who had to vote to actually support the funding for Land and Water got very little credit for it. And so that was a political error in the setup of the fund.
Yeah, exactly. Well, in the years that I worked, there were few instances where we did do the kind of highway signing where we would put up a sign in a park that said this park was constructed with funds from the Land and Water Conservation Fund. And that's something we came to in the 90s when we first began that effort, as you recall, 30 years ago, to try to revitalize the Land and Water Conservation Fund. And I'm just, over the moon and so happy that people didn't give up and that work continued, especially, as you say, with Senator Lamar Alexander, making sure that this fund finally got fully funded and is basically a trust fund now and can't be touched and can only be used for these purposes. I think that was a wonderful victory for the American people. We talk about so many negative things, but as you said, this was a bipartisan effort that did happen last year, and it's a legacy that will redound to future generations' benefit. Thank you for commenting on that. The other thing that has helped the great American outdoors that most people don't realize is all these partnerships that exist and that are necessary to manage and protect the great outdoors. And some of those partnerships involve concessions that operate all kinds of facilities, from the great lodges in the national parks at Yosemite or the Grand Canyon, all the way to campgrounds in local communities. So talk a little bit about partnerships and how those partnerships have worked over the years and played such an important role in in preserving and protecting the great outdoors?
Well, that's a wonderful question and a wonderful area to talk about, Don. A lot of people are unaware that many of the Grand Lodges in the national parks pre-existed the creation of the National Park Service
Yeah.
in 1916. Most of them were built by railroad companies. Really interesting. But, it was a source of competition between the Union Pacific and other railroads about if you take our trains from New York to California or back, we get to have a couple of nights with you in Yosemite National Park or in the Grand Canyon or in Glacier National Park or things like that. So these wonderful lodges were built as a way to reduce the burden, the hardships of spending 6 or 7 days on a train going transcontinental. And in fact, then when the Park Service was created, Stephen Mather, the first director, understood that this was an important part of building public support. And so he embraced the idea of partnerships to allow the hospitality experts of the time, the best in the world in terms of outfitters, guides, hoteliers, restaurateurs, to come in and operate in national parks and give guests, visitors to the national parks, great experiences. So they would go back and talk about the parks that they saw. So we've had that. We also have, for example, great partnerships in national forests. Almost all of the major ski areas that you will think of as you think about U.S. national ski areas are in national forests. Mm-hmm. And they have taken hillsides, mountainsides, and put in lifts and put in the other kind of accommodations that have allowed Americans to enjoy skiing. At this point, about 60% of all the skiing in this country, number of skier days, are actually in the national forest, and it's a great partnership between those. Just to give you an idea of how big this partnership is, the total volume of visitor spending in national parks for concessionaire services is about $2 billion a year. And that's, in contrast, the entire budget of the National Park Service is only $3 billion. And the concessionaires are responsible for the operating, the maintenance, and all of the updating of the lodges and the other kinds of things. They do provide additional capital investments that we could never see the Congress appropriating. If you want to go to Alcatraz, if you want to go to the Statue of Liberty, you take ferries that are provided by concessionaires. Those aren't Park Service operated boats. The Park Service does many things in a wonderful way, but we can't expect them to be the operators of boats and the flippers of hamburgers and other kinds of things. Those are jobs that are well done by partners. And of course, there are an array of nonprofit partners as well, right, who raise money through philanthropy and do a variety of other kinds of things. So it's a team effort to support the current level and what we hope will be a growing number of visits to the great outdoors. And it's a partnership that's I think thriving right now. There really is a good appreciation across the board about how we each can bring a special talent to the table to protect parks and to also allow their enjoyment now and for future generations.
I know during the course of my career, there was some criticism of partnerships, particularly from concessions, that they weren't doing enough to support parks and play a role. And I think our listeners would be interested to know that over the last several decades, that's really changed significantly. When concession contracts are written, they're written in such a way that there's a responsibility on the part of the concessionaires to support the parks in a variety of ways, whether it is you were saying providing for the maintenance, providing dollars for training, for rehabilitation of facilities. And so it's really an equitable partnership. The concessionaires benefit as a business, the parks or the national forest, or whether it's a ski area or campgrounds, they benefit as well. So these partnerships have developed over the years to be a real win-win for both the public, the concessionaires, and the governmental agencies that are doing the operations.
Great comments, and a couple things to just underscore. First of all, the private sector is involved in national parks and in national forests only on those activities that are found by the hosting agencies to be appropriate and necessary. In other words, we can't bring in golf courses, we can't bring in tennis courts, we can't bring in other kinds of things in a national park. Those are inappropriate, and the Park Service does not allow those kinds of activities. Secondly, in addition to the responsibilities for the operations and the maintenance of those, the concessionaires pay on average about 10% of gross revenues to the Park Service, and those are supplements to the appropriations. 80% of those payments are actually retained by the units. So, this year we'll see somewhere north of $150 million paid in franchise fees, and those franchise fees are critical to operations of the parks. Only about 40% of the budget of a big park like Yellowstone comes through the appropriated dollars that come from the Congress. The rest are through fees, whether it's entrance fees or concessionaire fees or philanthropy.
Right, exactly. Well, I have to correct something you said so I don't get a whole bunch of hate mail here soon. There are a few golf courses in national parks, and they're there appropriately. Some of the golf courses, for example, the East Bay in the East Bay Park, the East Bay Golf Course is part of the national park system. There's one in Rock Creek Park as well, and there are several others sprinkled around the national park system, but some of them did exist prior to that and are operated by concessions in an appropriate way as well. I know some of our listeners will be sophisticated enough to know that and write to me and say, okay, wait a minute, Don, there are a few golf courses in the national parks. But in most national parks, of course, they're not appropriate. So in the past few years, there has been the development of a number of organizations to promote access to the great outdoors for underserved communities. There's Latino Outdoors. I've had their founder on the program. There's Outdoor Afro and a number of others. This has been ongoing for 40 years, ever since you and I have been, our careers have been started. And as Director of State Parks in California, we develop programs to increase and promote access to local park and recreation programs and to the great outdoors in general. But yet we still hear complaints that people of color don't have equal access. People who live in the inner city don't have equal access. Underserved communities don't have access. And I must admit, as an African American myself who's been involved in outdoor recreation all my life, I've never felt like I didn't have access. And I grew up in the inner city, in the Crenshaw district, South Central LA. And I'm trying to understand, maybe from your point of view, and even from mine, so why do we still have so many people in communities that believe they don't have access to parks? And will we ever get to a point where all people feel they have access? I was just wondering what your perspective on that is.
Well, it is a genuine concern of yours, mine, and many others, and I think it's something we have to address. It's not that we have not seen creative efforts in the past. You were part of, and you know all about how Disney and Coleman and the city of LA and others came together around a program called WOW, Wonderful Outdoor World, where we brought camping into the inner city parks in LA and 10 other cities around the country, where we had a trailer that was loaded with tents and sleeping bags and other things. I think one of the things that we recognize is that our adult recreational activities are largely shaped by what we did as kids.
Yes.
And if as a kid we're not out there hiking and camping and fishing and doing other kinds of things, that's a problem, and we need to address it. We need to make sure that we have exposure. We also need to make sure that somehow we don't send an unintended kind of a message. Raul Grijalva is the chairman of the House Natural Resources Committee, a wonderful guy from New Mexico, and he is a 10th generation New Mexican in terms that's his family, lived there, and he didn't get to the Grand Canyon until he was 35 years old, and his dad didn't get to the Grand Canyon until he was in his 60s. Rawl brought him up there, and Rawl still tells the story about asking his dad, we lived only about 150 miles from the Grand Canyon. You never took us to the Grand Canyon. Why? And it breaks my heart to tell you this, but Rawls' dad said, I didn't think that the Grand Canyon was for people like us. Now, there are no signs that say, Latino and Hispanic and Native American and Black Americans not welcome here, but somehow that message is out there, and we just need to attack it as a nation to make sure that we are welcoming, and the stories that are being told in a way that it invites people. It tells the story of the Buffalo soldiers. It tells the story of other kinds of things about the role of people of color in our national parks going back hundreds of years.
Well, I couldn't agree more. I've had Shelton Johnson on the program telling the story of the Buffalo soldiers. I know Audrey Peterman. She was one of the most popular people that was on the program, a wonderful park advocate, particularly for the African American community. All these programs have been wonderful. Somehow I wonder, though, what the dichotomy or the difference is. And I'm glad you mentioned the Grand Canyon. My experience and my family's was just the opposite. When my mother and father migrated from Louisiana to California, one of the first stops, and we have photos of this, that we made was the Grand Canyon. And we have photos of our family standing on the rim of the Grand Canyon. Part of it was because my mother read Sunset Magazine, and she wanted to go everywhere that Sunset Magazine said Americans were supposed to go, and she wasn't going to let anybody stop her from going anywhere. So I think somehow it's also a matter of personal, initiative and just how you feel as an individual. And then when we got to California, one of the first places we went in the 50s was to Yosemite, because my mother said, we're going to Yosemite, because Sunset Magazine said it's a wonderful place to go, and there are things to go and see there. And so we never felt, in any way excluded or didn't feel those weren't places for us. I mean, and my message is the great American outdoors, or the outdoors, is where we all sprung from and evolved from as human beings, and nobody ever, for any reason, should feel like they don't have access or don't belong in the great outdoors. And I think you're right. We need to address the problem by telling more stories that people can connect to. That's extremely important. And some of these stories weren't told, particularly of the Buffalo soldiers and their contribution to protecting the national parks and natural areas, period. It's an extremely important story to be told, and I think that's something that can probably help as well. So we're coming to the end of the program, and I also need to ask is, other than climate change, what do you see as the greatest challenges facing the outdoors and the great American outdoors in the future, or the outdoors in general?
Well, I think we need to compete against sedentary lifestyles. I mean, one of the things that we know is that 75% of the healthcare costs in this country are associated with long-term treatment of chronic illnesses, most of which are acquired because of our lifestyle. So some of it's smoking, some of it's misuse of drugs, but a lot of it is just lack of being active. And I think part of what we have to understand is that in the future, payment for care of these wonderful public spaces out there should be done with at least some consideration of the benefits that we as a nation derive as the great outdoors being a wonderful health prescription. We can have fun outdoors in a way that contributes to our mental and our physical and our emotional health. So therefore, I think this is a major objective of mine right now, is to try to make sure that we find champions in the medical field. just 2 weeks ago at a hearing of the Subcommittee on National Parks, the new senator from Kansas, who is a physician, Senator Marshall, talked about how he was prescribing to his friends as a remedy for the stress that they had picked up from COVID-19 going to the national parks. And I think we just need to embrace that. We also need to understand that we can't just take the easy solution when we do have long lines in parks. That same hearing featured Ken Burns. And you know how well Ken Burns told the national park system story as a part of the centennial effort back in 2016, his 12-part PBS special on the national parks. He had an interesting piece of advice to the Senate subcommittee. He said, I know you're concerned about the lines to get into Yellowstone and other things. And he said, but we should take great comfort that Americans are voting with their time, with their feet to go to these places. We need to try to make sure that we help them make good choices using technology to tell them about alternative times or alternative places to go to see great vistas, to see wildlife, to spend time together outdoors. But we really don't want to close off without providing those alternatives. And I think that whole thing where Ken Burns said it's just like voting. We want to involve and invite people to vote in elections, and parks as part of the democratic process, the core of this nation. We want to encourage visitation of national parks in new and creative ways, in ways that allow people to have the experiences that they seek, and not to say, sorry, we're closed. There's no more capacity for you in our parks.
Oh, that is so true. I really have to apologize to my listeners. I wish I had, in support of what you're saying about the health and well-being of people, I wish I had a couple of quotes that I will post on our Life as a Story podcast website. The statements that Frederick Law Olmsted did in his Yosemite report that was it's like the 256th, I believe, this year anniversary of the release of that report. But in that report, he spent half of the report talking about how important it was to the health and well-being of the American people to have outdoor spaces. And he, of course, was talking about Yosemite in particular, but he talked about the fact that the businessman in New York who was under pressure and isolated in these bustling cities needed for their health and their well-being to get out into the great outdoors. But one of the most interesting things he said in that report, he said the most important people that the American outdoors benefits is, and these are his words, is the poor isolated housewife who is burdened with day-to-day activities and is not, getting out into the great outdoors. And he continued to argue that these are the most important people that the great American outdoors benefits, and that the health of the nation depended upon us preserving these wonderful outdoor resources. So I'm going to post that report on our website, and so our people can go to, our listeners can go to lifeasastorypodcast.com and see that quote for themselves. Frederick Olmsted was one of the great American landscape architects. He designed Central Park, had everything to do with making sure that Yosemite became a national park as well. So I certainly recommend some of his writings to our listeners. Well, so finally, Derek, what would you recommend that people do? Where should they go this month in the great outdoors? What are some of the activities they can participate in and enjoy our great American outdoors?
Well, Don, you started off the podcast by reading from a proclamation by our current president, Joe Biden, talking about getting out and seeing the outdoors. I would just make sure that everybody knows that starting with President Clinton and going through President Bush and then unbroken, Every president, DNR, have said the same thing. Do yourself a favor, go outdoors, explore, see the beauty of the nation, take pride in the fact that we as a nation have acted to preserve these. And I'll give you a little tip. One of the greatest ways to do that is to go to one of our national scenic byways. We have a system of almost 200 national scenic byways and all-American roads designated by the Secretary of Transportation following the creation of the Scenic Byways Program in 1991. They connect so many of our national parks. Several of the roads in our national parks, like the Blue Ridge Parkway, are in this system. But in terms of storytelling, not only does it take you to the well-known parks, it takes you to many of the lesser-known public land areas, and you will see America, and you will be able to see America's small towns. You'll be able to find people that are the storytellers extraordinaire, and the people who can take you down a river or can take you out to fish. Wonderful opportunities.
Right. Well, thank you, Derek. This has just been wonderful. It's been great to reconnect with you, and great to have you share your thoughts with the American people on the great American outdoors, actually with the world, because this podcast goes all over the world, and we appreciate you being on the program today. Thanks, Derek, and hopefully we'll have you back again.
Well, come and see me next time you're in D.C.
I'll certainly do that. Thank you,
Thanks,
Derek.
Don. Congratulations. Bye.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Life is a Story We Tell Ourselves. I hope that you've been inspired to get out and enjoy the great outdoors. Please subscribe to the podcast at lifeisastorypodcast.com. Subscribers receive updates on our new podcasts, and you can listen to past episodes. Stay safe, share happiness, and remember, never stop questioning. Curiosity has its own reason for existing.